shock horror, Kamal. Priti Patel, the former Home Secretary, is out of the first round of the Tory leadership race. We'll be bringing you all the latest.
And the present leader, Rishi Sunak, it's Prime Minister's Questions Day. What issues does he choose to attack the Prime Minister on?
And we will be devoting the second part of the Daily Tea today to analysing the Grenfell report, what it means for the families of the victims, and will anyone actually end up being jailed for this tragedy?
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Kamal Ahmed.
And me, Camilla Tominey.
I, being returning myself for the Legislative Committee in the leadership contest, do hereby declare the results of the first ballot as follows. And I'll read the results in alphabetical order. Kemi Badenoch, 22 votes. James Cleverly, 21 votes. Robert Jenrick, 28 votes. Priti Patel, 14 votes. Mel Stride, 16 votes. And Tom Tugendhat, 17 votes. So as a result of the ballot, Priti Patel is eliminated from the contest.
Kamal, wow.
Priti Patel out. Robert
I'm
Jenrick
saying wow, not because Priti Patel's out, that I've got something right.
Your prediction. Whisper it.
Whisper it, but I did say, didn't I, on
Priti
a previous
Patel.
Daily Tea that I thought she would be the first to go because they were being a bit circumspect about things. And Stride's people have been briefing for the last week that he has the numbers.
So Priti Patel out, Robert Jenrick in the lead at this stage. What does that say, do you think, Camilla, about where the parliamentary party is leading? Because the two, as you would describe them, righties, Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, have got between them 50 votes. So
Yes.
almost 50% of the parliamentary, well, not quite, but
Yeah.
a big chunk of the parliamentary party at this stage have voted for the two right-wing candidates. How much of an issue would it be, Camilla, if they went to the party with two candidates, Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, that actually came from what might be considered to be the same side
Yes.
of the party?
You could call it a write-off, couldn't you?
You could.
Right on right, blue on blue, very blue on very blue, rather than blue on light blue. Because I think people want the final two to be a righty and then a bit more of a one nationer like Tugendhat.
The parliamentarians, you think,
Yeah.
will want that, so they may
Well,
split
just
differently.
because I mean, if it's a righty versus a more centrist candidate, then the righty always wins with the grassroots because they prefer people to be as conservative as possible. And the grassroots and the membership is always more right-wing than the parliamentary party. It could be that just more people are declaring for Jenrick now. Don't forget, loads of people are undecided. If we add up all these figures, which, Kamal, you're far more qualified than I am to do these figures all add up to 121?
I don't know if everyone has voted. The interesting
50,
thing will
70,
be
80.
how,
No, loads of people haven't voted. So the IDSs of this world, Ian Duncan Smith, David Davis, some people have not publicly declared, and it strikes me, have not even voted in this thing. And then we have to look at where are all of Patel's supporters going to go?
Yes, that's
Are
the
they
key.
more likely to go with Kemi or Jenrick? Which is interesting. Look, cleverly bringing up the rear there in a kind of military way, which is befitting a man who used to be in the armed forces, is also interesting, isn't it? On 21.
he's not bringing up the rear, he's in third place.
He's bringing up the rear of the two righties.
Who do you consider to be the two righties? I thought Kemi Badenoch and
Jenrick.
Robert Jenrick. And then Cleverly, isn't Cleverly the leader in the sort of slightly softer camp?
He
I would
doesn't
maybe
like
suggest.
to be described
Okay,
as softer,
fair
but
enough.
he would be seen as a bit more one nation-y than those two, certainly.
He's certainly given a message which is less aggressive, let's put
Yes.
it that way, and I believe could be more attractive to those the voters that the Conservatives have lost in southern England, particularly to the Lib Dems and some to Labour, whereas Kemi Badenoch, Robert Jenrick are much more able to take the fight to reform. Of course, Cleverly says that they need to be talking to all constituencies, not to a few, and I'm sure all the leadership people are saying that. But Priti Patel, quite surprising. Is it because she is too much a signal of the past?
Yes,
Obviously, the
I think
immigration
so.
numbers, a lot of it was under her watch. The Rwanda plan was under her watch, although, of course, many Conservative supporters would support the Rwanda plan. And also, she has had issues about how she approaches leadership of teams, etc.
Yes. I think it's more about her being associated with the old guard and more specifically with Boris Johnson, perhaps. I think it's interesting that after Braverman was forced to pull out because of a lack of parliamentary support, we've now got a second former Home Secretary in trouble, which could indeed spell trouble for Cleverly, because the party is clearly blaming its own, and members are blaming the MPs that they think have failed the public on immigration. And so you have to be ticked off that list if you're a former Home Secretary who didn't bring the numbers down, both legal and illegal. So Cleverly's been playing a really good game of saying, unlike my predecessors, I did bring the numbers down and I did do this to working visas and I did do that and I do advocate Rwanda and all the rest of it. But it may come back to haunt him. Also for Patel, that is unfortunate for her as someone I would describe as a really accomplished and dedicated door knocker. She is a campaigner. She is somebody who has been involved in party politics, local and upwards, for decades. When people meet her, although she has this fearsome reputation and she's this poster girl for sort of left-wing hatred, she's actually a very personable woman who cares deeply, I mean sincerely, genuinely and deeply, about the Conservative Party, about Tory politics, about delivering on a constituency level, but also delivering for activists and the grassroots that keep the party propped up. So that's disappointing.
You could imagine for someone like Priti Patel, even though they've fallen out or fallen at the first hurdle, she could still have a major role in the new Conservative leadership because she has, as you say, has got a great sort of Conservative history and is liked by Conservative members.
Do you know what? She would be a brilliant party chairman.
Yeah, I was just thinking
because
that.
there's so many criticisms at the moment across all of the leadership camps about CCHQ, Conservative Campaign Headquarters, why it keeps on selecting people who some regard to be too Lib Demish to ever be Tories, that it's not coordinated enough in its response to Labour and what's happened just since Keir Starmer became Prime Minister. You know, at the end of the day, Priti has got that reputation for being an attack dog, but that's exactly what you need when you're the Tories in this desperate situation, trying to rebuild everything for 2029. So if I was going to be looking to win this leadership race, I would be having her inside the tent, certainly.
So the key thing will be, where do Priti Patel's supporters go for the next vote next Tuesday? Let's go to the board, our highly technical whiteboard visualisation of the race.
It's brutal,
Priti Patel. It's a brutal business, Priti. I'm so sorry to take you off. You were second from bottom amongst our readers in popularity, but sadly you've lost out there to Mel Stride.
Striding up the ranks.
Striding up the ranks. I would say then, so now let's swap them around. You've got Robert Jenrick amongst the parliamentary MPs has gone top. Mm-hmm. We have second, we are going for Kemi Badenoch, has gone second. Third, we have James Cleverly has gone third. I'm doing this in real time. It's exactly like Blue Peter, just as I've always wanted to do. James Cleverly, Tom Tugendhat, and Mel
Can
Stride.
I just make a point about the final two? Let's give Mel Stride some credit here. He's a complete rank outsider. He's not very well known outside the so-called Westminster bubble. And he is almost level pegging with Tom Tugendhat, who is seen as the sort of centrist candidate to perhaps make it into the final two. That could be a distortion of the numbers in a first ballot that may not be represented when it comes to voting again, I appreciate. But for Stride to get 16 to Tugendhat 17 is not a bad day at all for Stride.
Do you still imagine, as we approach November the 2nd over there, and I'm going to ask you for your prediction of who's going to win there, but that we will get to... I know it's not quite fair on James Cleverly. I take your point, but let's say the 3 here versus the 2 here in terms of parliamentary support. Of those 3, is Cleverly now the favourite if it is a shorthand left-right fight at the end.
Yes, because Cleverly is very popular with the grassroots, as Priti was. So he will pick up support there. They're both in neighbouring constituencies
Essex
as well.
people, yep.
And I was impressed by the turnout at Cleverly's launch, to be honest. It was busy, it was packed. So you're asking me, if it's down to Jenrick and Badenoch, at this stage, I can't call that. I've got to be honest. Having said that, I think people with a political memory might legitimately ask themselves where Jenrick has been for the last 15 years.
And he's moved into a much more, what might be described as aggressive position.
He has been on a journey.
He has.
Whereas Badenoch, I think, has always been a Thatcherite and been on the right side, and I mean right in terms of the right-wing side of the argument, on Brexit, on immigration, on culture wars, and all the rest of it. So, I mean, interestingly, if it is a write-off, then the membership get what they want either way, arguably.
And would you suggest at this stage that Kemi Badenoch is the best option overall? You were quite warm about her when we watched all the leaderships.
Like, oh, you've endorsed Kemi on
Maybe we
the
shouldn't
Daily
endorse at this
too.
stage.
No, I'm not endorsing anyone.
No.
I just was giving my view of how well all of the launches went.
Yes.
And in my view, her launch went by far the best because she just spoke very naturally and clearly, and she had star quality. That's what I'm trying to reflect here. She has got something that the others lack. And if she can take that forward, the concern remains she's too abrasive. She crosses the road to have an argument, and that's fine if she's taking the fight to Labour. But if she's going to start fighting within the party, that is the last thing they need. They've had enough infighting and enough blue on blue. But let's see how she develops during the course of this.
I think it's interesting that both James Cleverly and Kemi Badenoch have both said they don't believe an immigration cap is the right way forward. That's quite an interesting move against people like Robert Jenrick, Tom Tugendhat, who have both said there needs to be a cap. And I think that shows a different type of tone, which means that given that I believe, for example, you need to have some flexibility on immigration, I think Kemi Badenoch and James Cleverly have got more serious policy proposals.
So 6 have become 5. 5 are going to become 4 next week when MPs vote again.
Well, it's the first Prime Minister's Questions of the new parliamentary season. It's such an important weekly moment because you really get the sense not only of how the government is doing, but how does the opposition, the Conservatives now, want to handle the fight back.
Government is about making choices, and the new Prime Minister has made a choice. He has chosen to take the winter fuel allowance away from low-income pensioners and give that money to certain unionised workforces in inflation-busting pay rises. So can I just ask the Prime Minister, why did he choose train drivers over Britain's vulnerable pensioners?
As we thought, Camilla, Rishi Sunak probably going to start off with laying out a list of things that the government has already done that are proving controversial. And winter fuel allowance, the taking away of the winter fuel allowance for pensioners not on pensioners' credit, has got to be the key one of those.
Certainly because he can't really attack the smoking ban, seeing as he wanted to
Absolutely.
outlaw generational smoking. Just observing both front benches there isn't quite the spring in Labour's step. If you just look at Angela Rayner and Rachel Reeves, and they're very glum and they're looking very tired. This is what government does to you, Kamal. What are they, 5-6 weeks in? Looking a little tired, a little frayed around the edges after the summer break.
Absolutely. And yesterday in Treasury Questions, Rachel Reeves said that last year pensioners had seen an income increase in the state pension of £900. And then this morning, Treasury figures were leaked that said that next pension increase will be £400. So they're clearly trying to create a story that pensioners are getting better off. Because I'm told from people, very close to the Chancellor, that they are going to dig in on this issue and that it has been a choice. And as Rishi Sunak has said, if the choice is between pensioners and public sector workers, they have chosen public sector workers.
Indeed. Politically wrong-headed in my mind, but let's continue listening.
Mr. Speaker, this government was elected to clear up the mess left by the party opposition and to bring about the change that the country desperately needs. Our first job was to audit the books. And what we found was a £22 billion black hole. Well, it's no good them complaining. Richard Hughes, the chair of the OBR, was very clear. He described it as one of the largest overspends against forecast outside of the pandemic. His words. So we've had to take tough decisions to stabilise the economy and repair the damage, including targeting winter fuel payments whilst protecting pensioners. 800,000 pensioners are not taking up pension credit. We intend to turn that around. We're going to align housing benefit and pension credit, something the previous government deferred year after year after year. And because of our commitment to the triple lock, pensions are projected to increase by over £1,000 in the next 5 years.
Rishi Sunak.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister also inherited inflation back at target, interest rates being cut, unemployment low, and indeed the fastest growing economy in the G7, Mr. Speaker. But that's not the point, because the Prime Minister now has to start taking responsibility for his own decision. And if, as he says, the public finances are a priority, it was his decision, and his decision alone, to award a train driver on £65,000 a pay rise of almost £10,000. And it was also his decision that a pensioner living on just £13,000 will have their winter fuel allowance removed. So can the Prime Minister explain to Britain's low-income pensioners why he has taken money away from them whilst at the same time given more money to highly paid train drivers?
Good politics, this from Rishi. He's good at politics. In opposition, not necessarily leadership. But it's really clear that for the public, this is why this is important, because the idea of taking away from little old grannies who are choosing between heating and eating, that's the kind of attack line you would have expected Labour in opposition to make of the Tories. He's turning the tables, and I think people are frustrated with this idea of train drivers and junior doctors and other people in unions receiving ever greater sums.
Also, Rishi Sunak knows he's in Parliament. He can see behind Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, both on the front bench there, all the Labour MPs who are feeling just as uncomfortable as he's trying to make them feel.
Yes, cringy.
What does Labour come in to do? Fight inequality, fight poverty. So just the use of the words low-income pensioners. You have taken away money from low-income pensioners. As you say, is smart politics, because it doesn't only speak to the public, it is speaking to the uncomfortableness of all the MPs behind Keir Starmer who are going to have to defend this on the doorstep.
We will, of course, continue to stand by Israel's right to self-defence. But it is important that we are a country committed to the international rule of law. That gives us the strength of argument with our allies on important issues. This is a difficult issue, I recognise that, but it's a legal decision, not a policy decision. And the Prime Minister knows the framework, and they issued the guidance, they know what the test is, that test has been assessed, we've come to a conclusion, and we've put that before the House to consider.
Reminding me very much of Brexit there. This idea that it's a legal decision, not a policy one, him very much playing up to his former loyally connections as the former director of public prosecutions. But the question that people are asking themselves is, it may well be within a legal framework and be in accordance with international law. The timing was off, happening literally as Israelis were burying loved ones. And was it necessary, or will it actually change anything, Kamal? That's the criticism. Interesting that Sunak has really gone for the jugular, first of all on pensioners and now on this, which has caused concern. It's caused a lot of concern about whether Britain is actually not being the true ally to the only functioning democracy in the Middle East that it should be.
I think Rishi Sunak has had a good Prime Minister's questions. I think he's on stronger territory, probably politically, on the winter fuel allowance. I think on the decision by the government to stop a minority of possible arms going to Israel is something that there is an argument about. Obviously, many people have a different view, but it is arguable that that is the right way forward given the allegations about what those arms could have been used for. So I think he's got an arguable case on Israel, whereas the winter fuel allowance, I think, is much, much more difficult. And I feel his performance on the winter fuel allowance answers, throwing it all back on your record, the black hole, that doesn't really work.
Because everyone knows he's got a choice. Sunak was right to point that out.
Exactly. And I think if you listen to Keir Starmer's answer, it is reasonable. You may agree or disagree with it, but it was a reasonable answer that there is a legal framework, and it is a minority of the contractual arrangements we have providing arms to Israel, and also the UK in general has a very small role in Israel defending itself. So although politically the optics can look poor, as the chief rabbi made very, very clear, in actual fact the effect is de minimis on Israel's ability to prosecute its hunt for, well, of course, freeing the hostages, but more importantly almost is getting rid of Hamas.
Absolutely recognise and support Israel's right to self-defence and have taken action in support of that right of self-defence. And I've made that repeatedly clear in all of my engagements with Israel across the region and with all of our allies. I absolutely stand by that. But in relation to licences, this isn't an Israel issue. It's the framework for all licences that have to be kept under review. It's the same test for all licences, as the Prime Minister knows. And having applied the law to the facts and come to a legal conclusion, I don't think the Prime Minister is really inviting me to put that to one side. We have to, the Leader of the Opposition, this is a serious issue. We either comply with international law or we don't.
Camilla, what do you think to this argument? It's an interesting one that he's put forward, that you get the legal advice. It is not then the government's role. This was the criticism, obviously, before the Iraq war, that they received legal advice and then they wanted that legal advice changed under, obviously, that was Tony Blair. And the government was hugely criticised for not aligning to what could initially have been the legal advice about the legality of an invasion of Iraq. In this instance, Keir Starmer is saying the same thing. We had legal advice on 30 of the arms export licenses of the 350 that the UK had with Israel, and 30 of them could be considered to be breaching international humanitarian law.
Well,
does it? I just wondered if it's you feel it's a strong argument about why you have to follow the advice.
Well, lawyers advise and ministers decide. And they could be, these licences, but we know there are other political reasons for this, that he's trying to be all things to all men. He's in one breath trying to kowtow, I think, to the pro-Palestinian forces within his party and threatening his party, while also saying that Israel has the right to defend itself, which he had shied away from, having first made that statement on LBC with Nick Ferrari. But equally, the geopolitical implications of it are that some could argue that the Labour government has just added itself to Hamas's list of useful idiots, because it doesn't do anything at all to encourage Hamas to release the remaining hostages. So he's being slightly disingenuous when he's saying we've only done this because of the legal advice. He's done this for political reasons.
Camilla, you've written that you haven't been overly impressed with the opposition to this Labour government. This is the first Prime Minister's questions back for the new term. Obviously, only the second Prime Minister's questions between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, and Keir Starmer still confusing his role as now the Prime Minister, not leader of the opposition, and calling Mr Sunak the Prime Minister. How do you think both sides did, but particularly the opposition, which you have been very critical of?
Well, I think the opposition should be more coordinated, should take the gloves off and take the fight to Labour, not least when they've had a pretty bad start. Keir Starmer's approval rating is tanking. They seem to be waiting for the next iteration of Conservatism to come after the leadership race is concluded on November the 2nd. And my argument in my column was, no, it starts now. You can't wait for weeks, because at the moment Labour's looking pretty vulnerable, and I think they should exploit those vulnerabilities. I think actually Rishi Sunak has done that quite effectively today. He's got quite a good... We saw some of this in the debates. We did see him saying things. Remember that good line about Starmer? What are you going to do? You're going to sit down and negotiate with the Taliban in Afghanistan? He can do it. He's still a bit head boyish. And let's be honest, he's seeing a horizon ahead of leadership where he shall be going to the backbenches and beyond. But it's quite interesting to see him in the context of the favourite, Kemi Badenoch, because people like her because she's an attack dog who crosses the road to start a fight. That is not Sunak's shtick, but actually that method, that kind of quite calm, considered questioning, and sort of, it's almost like he expresses a degree of boyish incredulity.
He's still carrying that slight prime ministerial thing.
Yes,
I've done it,
yes.
which I think is useful. I would say that he won that
that's
contest.
definitely a 1-0.
I think doing winter fuel payments actually was absolutely right. Uncomfortable for Labour backbenchers, very negatively received by the public and, of course, pensioners. Israel, more arguable, but again, picked the right subject. The key to Prime Minister's questions is picking the right subject that makes the opposition, your opposition, the government in this case for Rishi Sunak, uncomfortable. And he did that twice, and that was smart. Keir Starmer, I thought, quite weak on winter fuel payments. And then on Israel, arguable, but not very passionate.
But also just reminds people of the worst of him, which is I am a lawyer and I stick to the rules, which hasn't served him very well for the last fortnight.
Early this year, he was forced to go back to work to earn the extra money for the cost of caring for his wife. As their income is just a few £100s above the limit for pension credit, they're set to lose their winter fuel allowance unless the Prime Minister listens to these benches and others and changes this plan. So if he doesn't, what advice does the Prime Minister have to Norman and Ros and millions of struggling pensioners as they face rising heating bills this winter?
We have entered the parallel universe where we've now got Ed Davey, the leader of Liberal Democrats, ganging up with Rishi Sunak, the leader of the Conservatives, on this used to be reversed. It used to be the Lib Dems and Labour having a go at the Tories. So
we knew this, but now, Camilla, how would you answer this? You're the leader of the government that's decided to take away the winter fuel allowance up to £300 a year for pensioners. How would you answer? Then let's see how Keir Starmer answers.
The only way he can answer is to repeat the difficult decisions we're having to make on the back of the black hole, and then make the point that the poorest pensioners can apply for the pension credit, more of which we're making available, yada, yada, yada.
I think he needs to show a human touch by responding to the care issue that Ed Davey has said, rather than going straight into politics speak. And I think the second thing is to remind people that the pension and the pension increase for next year, because of the triple lock which the Labour Party has backed, obviously the previous government's original policy, that is why they have made this difficult decision.
The final Grenfell Inquiry report has been published, Kamal. It's been chaired by Sir Martin Moore-Bick, a retired judge of the Court of Appeal. And let's be honest, it's absolutely damning. He placed the blame on decades of failure by government ministers and officials who ignored warnings over the risk of cladding fires.
The Department of Communities and Local Government, the report says, had received numerous warnings about the risks posed by the cladding in the 5 years between 2012 and 2017, but shockingly ignored them.
He's also making the point that the regulators in all this put commercial interests above building safety and had been, quotes, complicit in allowing manufacturers to manipulate fire tasting data. They engaged in deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate the testing processes, misrepresent test data, and mislead the market, he said.
Really damning. And then on the actual night of the fire and subsequent days, the government and local authorities have been condemned in the inquiry for their response, which was branded muddled, slow, indecisive and piecemeal.
Let's just pick out the quote that will really be most upsetting to the bereaved. Sir Martin Moore-Bick met with them on Tuesday and told them quite simply the deaths were all avoidable.
Let's hear from a spokesman for Grenfell Next of Kin, which looks after the interests of the bereaved.
The morning after the fire, before anyone knew who was dead or alive, an inquiry was ordered by the Prime Minister in 2017, days after a very divisive and contentious snap election. And that locked all of these families into a process that has delayed justice and has denied justice. And at the end of it, we have 10 kilos of words on pages. As we heard from one of the barristers, the only people that did really well out of this were the lawyers. £173 million, I believe, the last count, to deliver the words. As damning as they might be, as thorough as it might be, it does not equal justice for these families.
The Telegraph's chief reporter, Robert Mendick, joins us in the studio today. Lovely to see you, Rob. Look, you've been at the centre of this story from the very beginning, and you've had quite a morning.
Quite 24 hours, actually, Camilla. This report is vast, and it's huge, and it's hard work, and it's over 1 million words, 1,700 pages, 15,337 footnotes alone. It weighs in at 10 kilos. It's in 7 volumes. And to put it into context, that's twice the size of War and Peace and around about a third larger than the Bible.
Robert, can you just take us, how, as a journalist, as you say, Camilla, you've been, you were one of the first reporters there. You've been covering it for the Telegraph for the past 7 years. How do you even start to make sense of a report that big? What happens?
It's interesting. It's hard is the answer, and it's not straightforward. And it's what's called a lock-in. You get an embargoed copy early with an undertaking which we all signed not to break that embargo before 11 o'clock today. We first got a look at the report yesterday at 2 o'clock at the site where the inquiry was taking place, out in Paddington.
So this is a literal room where you go, and when you say a lock-in, do you go and sit in a room?
You sit in a room, and we're given hard copies of the document. And then there's an executive summary, which makes life a lot easier, frankly, and that runs to, I think it was 25 pages. And then there's a further 25 pages, I think, of recommendations. The executive summary sort of brushes over stuff. You then have to go and look at it. And so it's a sort of an exercise in... It's almost like a sort of what an undergraduate would do. It's an exercise in research in some respects. Mm. And but you've got to obviously do it with a journalist's eye and a journalist's nous of where the stories are. And there's lots of clues, and the inquiry sort of points you in the right direction. But you get 3 hours. We had 3 hours yesterday to look at it, and we had a further 2.5 hours today before 11 o'clock to look at it. So that's 5.5 hours to go through something that's twice the size of War and Peace. I mean, that's not an unreasonable way of putting it. So me and a colleague did it, Henry Bodkin, give him a big name check, who's another very capable Telegraph reporter. But it can be bewildering and it can be difficult. And so you sit there and you have to have some kind of strategy, and you have to kind of work out what you're looking for, first of all. And you have to accept, I'm afraid, that we're going to have missed stuff. And I think in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 days, I guess we'll keep combing through it and we'll see what we've missed. Because none of us are going to spot everything, frankly.
Rob, we've gone through the headlines of the report, but for you, having worked on this story for 7 years, what most sort of shone out to you in this report?
Well, the comprehensiveness of it. I mean, Sir Martin Morbeck, who's a fantastically eminent judge, former Court of Appeal judge who was put in charge of the inquiry, with a very big brain, very technical, has methodically gone through all the documents with his team and all the evidence and laid it out. It's pretty clear. It's judicial. It's not the most kind of damning language at times. And I think for headline writers that can be difficult. And I think for people looking for simple answers it can be difficult, because people, in the reality, the survivors and the victims and the bereaved, really want to get justice done. And I don't think this report may end up not being quite what they were looking for, because they want to see people ideally in court and ideally behind bars, and that's going to be difficult.
And that will be the next stage, won't it, Rob? What happens now? Now we have this huge report in terms of what could happen criminally, which is what actually a lot of the survivors want to see happen 7 years in.
The police and Crown Prosecution Service will now go through the report. They can't use the evidence given at the inquiry by witnesses to then hold that against them. These kind of undertakings have been given at other public inquiries, such as Bloody Sunday, where soldiers gave evidence. So the understanding is you're frank and you're open with the inquiry, but it's based on the fact that the evidence I give can't be used against me. So the police can't use that evidence in the testimony to say, aha, we can now charge you because that's what you said at the inquiry. They then now have to go about it and say, probably they will use it as a guide, but you've also got to remember the police have had their own parallel inquiry running for the last 7 and a bit years. So it'll still take the police, you can see how long the report is, and you can see how long it's going to take them. They say sort of 12 to 18 months from now on in before you can expect charges at the earliest.
Do you feel, is your sense that, given inquiries you've covered in the past, that criminal charges, either corporate manslaughter for business or against actual individuals, be they officials or other people in government or even politicians possibly, do you think there's any chance of that actually happening?
I think there's huge pressure to bring charges, and I think that'll be very hard for the CPS and the police to resist, if I'm being honest. And I think that's right. Whether you then get convictions is a slightly different question and I think a slightly different answer. So my kind of gut feeling is you'll get charges. Some of them may be very low bar health and safety things, I'm afraid. There might be the odd misconduct in a public office. Corporate manslaughter doesn't get anyone in jail, I'm afraid. It gets fines. And then there's sort of gross negligence manslaughter, which is the sort of, I guess, the highest one up the chain. And the bar for that is really high. I think there'll be a lot of desire to charge people with the most serious charges they can put against them. Whether you get convictions or not, I hate to say it, I'd be very nervous.
Rob, we know the victims' families have spoken and the survivors, but just because you're embedded with them and you know them very well, to you as a journalist, what are the sorts of messages they're sending you today? What are they saying to you in terms of taking this case forward and reporting on it in the coming weeks?
Yeah. This is not the panacea that many of them were seeking. I'm sure there are many survivors who will be very happy with this report, and it is a brilliant report in many ways, and it goes through all the detail. But for them, they do want justice. They want to see people in the dock, and they've made that very clear. The group Grenfell Next of Kin it has not been happy that the inquiry took place ahead of criminal charges, which is the order in which we've ended up doing this. Public inquiry came first, and the charges will come after. Hence, the 7 years down the track, and we still don't have any charging, and may not get them for a decade after the fire. So Sir Martin Moore-Bick met the bereaved yesterday, and he told them there the deaths were all avoidable. But I don't think this is necessarily going to help the victims, really. You know, clearly the deaths were all avoidable. Nazanin Aglani, who lost her mother and aunt, tells me it was evident there were multiple failures on the night. I didn't need a public inquiry to tell me that. I'm sitting here 7 years later and being told the very obvious things that were known from the first day and needed a police investigation on criminal charges, with an inquiry happening after, which is the norm. In reality, she says, the inquiry has given a platform for the potential defendants to put on a show and blame each other. That's the blame game that we've talked about and talked about on our special podcast. This public show has become a web of blame and acts as a protection for them, and has been gruelling for us as we've had to engage on a daily basis for over 7 years. We didn't ask for a public inquiry. What we wanted was prosecutions, and this doesn't bring any closure. So that's just one voice, and there will be others, and there will be a multitude of them. But that gives you a sense of certainly some of the people I've spoken to.
This is obviously a big staging post, Rob. I think the powerful words from the bereaved are really, really important. But for you, having now gone through as much of the report as is possible in the time you've been given. As you say, we're going to keep covering this over the next few days, and more may well come out from the inquiry. One thing that surprised me from reading what I've been able to read so far is the years, decades of mistake building on a shortcut here, a slight lie there, a tweak here, ending up in this appalling conflagration and fire at Grenfell. What's your big takeaway from this? And Camilla, you and I, already in the 4 short months of this podcast, have sat here discussing official inquiries into the health service, maternity services, the infected blood scandal, every time seeing officials particularly and business leaders not doing their jobs.
Yeah.
I just wondered, Rob, it can add to just a feeling of helplessness that people who were running the companies that provided the cladding, the politicians who were in charge of the regulations, the officials who should be making sure the regulations were enforced, have all just failed.
Yeah, you kind of despair.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest. And when you look at the report laid bare, all the things we know but put in one place, you sort of wonder what kind of country we're in.
Yes.
What kind of country we are, really, that we are this useless, this incompetent, that you can have a fire in a tower block. You can put combustible cladding, highly flammable cladding, on a tower block where you know your fire engine ladders can't reach, and then tell them all to stay put.
No.
When the whole thing is on flames. But to have even got to that stage where we allowed this to happen. So, for instance, the subcontractor in charge of the cladding operation and putting it on, called Harley, the owner of that company employed his 25-year-old son as the chief project manager on the project. His only qualification was he had a foundation degree in sports motor engineering. The chief fire assessor for the TMO, that's the tenant management organisation that managed the building on behalf of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Well, in fact, they only had one chief fire assessor for 650 properties across the borough. He had no experience to check fire safety on a building of the height and complexity of Grenfell, says the report. And moreover, he invented, is the phrase they use, his qualifications when he took up the role, which he had for 7 years until after the fire.
What struck me, Rob, is that often we look at these sorts of cases and we think, is it just a series of catastrophic cock-ups, or is there a conspiracy here? And from your initial write-up, it's a bit of both, isn't it? Because the report also lays bare sort of the relationship between the regulators, the cladding suppliers, the managing groups, people all in it together, benefiting from each other's seeming negligence over asking the right questions. I mean, as you say, this was a case about fire safety. I thought we lived in a country where there was sometimes people object to it, too much health and safety, it's health and safety gone mad. And yet these most basic of principles were completely cast aside, seemingly in the interests of people just making a tidy sum, thank you very much, tarting up these tower blocks.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one because it's not the Telegraph worldview, but this is venal stuff. This is money-making capitalist stuff at its most basic, and it is cutting corners. It is saving bits here and there. It's finding cheaper cladding that turns out to be combustible. I don't think it's any coincidence that 85% of the people in the tower were from ethnic minorities. These are the poorest people in the worst housing. So it is a combination of sheer uselessness and cock-up, but there is also an element of money grabbing, bad behaviour, frankly. And sorry, one other thing that does strike me, and is that, and I remember at the time we all cheerleaded for the burning of red tape, pardoning the pun. But when austerity came in and the government, David Cameron, declared we're going to have a war on red tape, we all cheered for that. The reality is, of course, you tear up red tape, you tear up things like fire regulation control, and that's how you end up with this mess.
I was surprised by the international nature of it as well, Camilla, that there were companies in America, in France, these global networks that then aren't controlled. So I think you're absolutely right, Camilla, that regulatory capture There was too cosy a relationship between who was supposed to be regulating and the businesses within building safety. I think the architects as well have been criticised. But I was also struck, Rob, by your reporting in the Telegraph today, the international nature, and it's very hard to regulate. Companies were going around finding the markets where things were weakest.
Yes.
And the UK was sort of on their list as a
And
target.
exploiting
Yeah,
them.
we can't do it to this country or that country because they're going to be too strict, but the UK is a bit loose here, it's a bit loose here. We can therefore use this material, cheaper material, that's a higher margin for us as a business. I mean, Rob, it does make you, despair is a word, but is there any hope, Rob, do you think, from the recommendations? Are there simple recommendations from what you've seen that at least we are now in a safer position? And of course, we're still forgetting that people with flats and apartments with cladding are still stuck and can't move, and fire safety certificates 7 years on still not being fixed. Is there some hope, Rob, from the recommendations that might give us something that we can sort of say, well, something has come out of the inquiry?
Simple answer is yes and no. There's 58 recommendations. They're quite detailed, as you can imagine. They're quite technical. I think what veterans of inquiries will tell you is there'll be a lot of noise. There'll be a lot of gnashing of teeth. Keir Starmer will stand up in the House of Parliament and say, you know, we must embrace this and we must take on all the recommendations. The recommendations have a habit of not being put in place or of being ignored, actually. So I think the answer is, I'm sure it'll be in a better place than it was, and it'll be in a better place than it was for, they say, the next 10 years. It'll be scrutinised, and then these things fall by the wayside for whatever reason, and events take charge. So I'm a bit gloomy, if I'm being brutal about it, that lessons will be learned. I'm sure there won't hopefully ever be another Grenfell again, but there'll be some other disaster where we should have learnt from something else. I mean, in the case of Grenfell, we knew about cladding fires, we knew about the risks of failure of compartmentalisation in tower blocks. It wasn't something they shouldn't have known about, and as early as 1999. So that was a Labour government, by the way.
Yeah,
the government was
Select
being
Committee
told.
report, yeah.
The government was being told cladding poses a blooming great risk. Don't stick it on tower blocks. So, go figure that we learn anything. I don't think we do.
Rob, it's a really sad day. Thank you so much for your reporting, for the whole team that have been working on this. And obviously there'll be a lot more to come over the next few days, and we'll, of course, be following the stories over the months and years ahead.